So the next speaker is about now porous media under cyclic loading. I have the pleasure to introduce Auke Barnhoorn, who is Associate Professor in Applied Geophysics and Petrophysics at TU Delft. Auke holds PhD from ETH Zurich and specializes in rock mechanics, rock structure visualization, and acoustic measurements during deformation.
Thank you.
And also he is the director of our geoscience department laboratory as well. So he has all these triaxial tests and all the things about
Thank you, Hadi.
Please.
And maybe you've noticed a little boy on the top left corner.
We have hit the record of the youngest participants. So we moved from 16 to now. Hoe oud ben je, Thomas? Hoe oud ben je? 8. Okay, 8 years old. 8. So from 16 now 8. And I guess and hoe oud ben jij? 9. So we have a 9-year-old also here and 8. And next year we want
Hadi brings his son tomorrow.
Oh, mine is 2. Next year we want more babies coming to with the trolleys and all. Okay, please.
Yeah, so today we perfectly timed the taking care of our sons, but since we have delayed, Thomas is here, but he's been in class more often. At the end of the classes we always draw elephants on the board or animals, so maybe we do that also afterwards. So thanks, Hadi. I will present an overview of what I think is important for the geomechanical aspects for underground hydrogen storage in porous rocks. And I'll show some results of projects that deal with cyclic loading, not yet cyclic loading with hydrogen as the pore fluid, but cyclic loading experiments in the laboratory. Milat, who is helping organizing, has done those experiments, so you'll see results at the end of the presentation. For me, I think you have also said that there are 2 types of porous rocks that are important for hydrogen storage. The saline aquifers, as well as the hydrocarbon fields, or any field that has been depleted and then reused for hydrogen storage. There are 2 critical differences in the 2 for me. Mechanical difference, of course, there are more. And that's because of the fact that the saline aquifers have, let's say, a geological fluid pressure in there, and as soon as you start injecting your hydrogen, the pressure will increase. And pressure increase might mean stress state changes that could lead to failure or rock fracturing, and Herminio pointed to those. And so that's a field from a geomechanical point at least, to be careful with. And then you have your depleted fields, where the hydrocarbon production have reduced fluid pressure to a large extent or a certain extent. If you start injecting hydrogen into that, of course your fluid pressure increases. And basically what we often assumed, until you hit or you reach the pressure that was at the start of the production of the hydrocarbons, that's what we say, you could be in a safe zone, providing, of course, that depletion process and injection process did not do anything to the material. That did not change any of the mechanical properties of the porous rocks you're dealing with. So 2 different fields that basically deal with the same thing. Pressure changes lead to stress changes, and that might lead to integrity problems, formation of fractures, seismicity, etc., etc. And I try to illustrate that, which I always do with students, in a very simple diagram, our Morse-Coulomb failure diagram, and Herminio called it short-term failure boundary. I think for me that's the same thing, fracturing of the reservoir. If you are at a stress state where you have your maximum stress conditions, typically a vertical stress on, that's where is that side of your more circle, and your minimum stress is on the other side, and the size of the circle basically is dependent on the tectonic setting where you're in. How far your circle is to the right or the left is typically depth in the earth. So how deep you are. And then if you start injecting, pore fluid goes up, effective stresses go down, because stress minus pore fluid, if your pore fluid increases, your effective stress drops, so your circle moves to the left. Yeah? Moving to the left is okay until you hit the red line, until you hit your Coulomb failure criteria, and then you might have fracturing failure, etc., etc. So depending where you are in tectonic settings, your circle can be tiny. You have lots of room to move to the left. You might also be in areas where your circle is already quite large, and then moving to the left, you could quickly hit that envelope. Well, the injection one, where your circle had a certain size in the beginning, your hydrocarbon depleted field, where you start producing, you've produced your hydrocarbons first. Your circle is at a certain position. Now I've drawn it very close to the boundary, but it could also be very far to the left. If you produce, your fluid pressure goes down, so your effective stress conditions go up. So the circle moves to the right, and then by injecting your hydrocarbons, you have room to play with. And that safe window is often used as an argument, better go for depleted fields. And for example, I think in one of the other slides I think I show, in the cyclic one, that we use that for gas storage. That's the field where we do temporary gas storage. We use that argument that as long as you stay below the pressures, the fluid pressures of your pre-production reservoirs, you are okay. What for me are the important items for hydrogen storage? From a geomechanical point of view, I think is your changes of stress due to pore pressure fluctuations, what I just talked about. So critical. What hydrogen might do with your porous rocks in terms of does it change the mechanical behavior or not? Not much studied yet, but I think it's critical. What I really see as something very critical is we are starting to do this in a cyclic manner. For salt caverns, we might do that actually on a quite short-term manner. In porous reservoirs on a longer term, but geological still short. So does that cyclic behavior have an influence? And the experiments of Milad do show that cyclicity is critical. And of course, if you go over that more column failure boundary, you might reactivate pre-existing faults. You might form new fractures that are either occurring somewhere in the reservoir, but it could also occur, of course, in your cap rock. And what happens then? If you now think about the mechanical changes of the presence of hydrocarbon, does hydrocarbons affect porous material? Not much studied yet. It's mentioned a lot in literature. We did a search and I couldn't find a study that showed if you put hydrocarbons in there, then your mechanical behavior changes by so many percent. I don't think there are many experiments have been done, or certainly not published. I could imagine that some of us are doing those experiments at the moment, but there's not a lot available there. What you do see in the literature, that hydrocarbon causes maybe dissolution precipitation processes of material, might have an effect on clay swelling, and I think that's primarily in materials that have fluids, not hydrogen, water. Water-rich minerals might be influenced heavily by hydrocarbons. So I think we should go for those rock types. Pure sandstones, probably not a lot of effect of the hydrogen in there. Maybe clayey materials, carbonates with sulfates in there, sulfates, that might have an effect. And what that effect is a big question. I always think about fluid type in mechanics is important, but whether we do an experiment with water, CO2, or a hydrocarbon or oil in our porous medium, it doesn't really, on the short term, doesn't really change the mechanical behavior. On long terms, those fluid might cause mineral reactions, and then the mechanical behavior might change. What change that is, we need to see. I've just drawn now a very, very big, white, more Coulomb failure criteria. Does this line go up due to mineral changes, due to reactions with hydrocarbons? Then, well, it's good, it's nice. Is the line going down? then of course failure seismicity might occur quicker. Does the slope of the line change, either in a more steep change or less steep, then we really need to determine exactly those conditions. So for our lab, for other labs in the world, that is maybe one of the challenges that we face in the future. Can we better quantify mechanical changes of the mechanical behavior of rocks if they have been exposed to hydrocarbon for longer or shorter durations? And until we have done that, I think then we still live with a larger uncertainty in the modeling approaches. I talked about cyclicity. I think that's where certainly major interest in our research group is that, but I think in a lot of labs, what does cyclic fluid pressures do with material changes over time? Because the cyclicity that we see in porous reservoirs is on a seasonal, so yearly scale, which is quite fast. If you then think about the bar or the pressure changes that we would like to invoke in hydrogen storage, those changes are actually pretty significant. So if we're not able to well understand the mechanical effect of cyclicity, I think then it will be difficult to really do this in a safe and a proper manner. So, cyclic behavior should not affect the material, and I use this word should deliberately, should not have any influence as long as our circle stays below. Yeah? But that means that this line also should not change. So if we stay below and the line is not changing due to cyclicity, then there's no problem. And that's what, for example, some of the fields in the Netherlands are doing. 10 minutes? Perfect. Yeah? Where they have underground storage of just hydrocarbon gas for our seasonal demand in fluids. They have a pre-production initial pressure, and they try to cycle close or below that, and we are safe. We should not have any seismicity there. Now I come to the experiments of Milad, the PhD student here in Delft. He's in his last year, so he's wrapping up. What he did experiments where we said, okay, we cycle our fluid pressures and our stresses in a region that we call elastic behavior. So we should not see major changes, and in regions that are getting closer to the inelastic, so closer to where our rock sample will start to fail. And he cycled not in a seasonal base sequence, but more in like an hourly sequence. He cycled the fluid pressures and stresses and looked at how that affects the strain in the material and the seismicity, or the lab-based seismicity at least. So if we look at here, we did a cycling experiment at quite low stress conditions, and then a cyclic experiment at higher stress conditions. And Milad also varied, let's say, the time of the cycles, as well as the amplitude of the fluid and stress pressures in the system. And what he observed in the data is that in both cases, at the high stress experiments as well as the low stress experiments, he noticed not only elastic behavior but also inelastic behavior. So permanent deformation, and I think you could call it also creep, like Hermenio did. Has something permanent happened in the material in both conditions, considerably more at high stresses than at low stresses, but there's always some inelastic behavior, so permanent deformation of the material. He also noticed the first cycle is the one that creates most of the inelastic response. So after one cycle, the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth don't have a same effect as the first one. So that's reassuring, I guess. But there's always inelasticity in the system. And at the same time, we also measured the acoustic emission, seismicity, in those cycles. Same thing, we see most of the seismicity is present in the first cycle with also the biggest magnitude or the amplitude events there. And then you have less and less acoustic emission with progressing cycles in the system. More seismicity in the early state or in the high stress state than in the low stress conditions. So if you think about that safe storage, you really should try to stay low and to avoid, if you go too high in your stress conditions, too high in your fluid pressure, then maybe you have seismicity occurring in the system. So stay low, and then, but if your first cycle is relatively silent, not a lot of seismicity, then maybe second, third, and fourth should be better. And I think for a modeling perspective, it is we clearly saw a relationship in the amount of inelasticity, and I think that's something that Herminio is, for example, able to model in his experiments, a relationship with the acoustic emission in there. So if he's able to predict in a porous rock that breaks brittly the inelastic strain, then maybe we should be able to predict what kind of seismicity response is there. One more set of experiments, and I think that's for a long-term storage perspective important. Milad cycled at some conditions, and then he said, let's do a lot of cycles at stress levels below the stress levels before. Now, and what you see is that you have silent behavior, hardly any seismicity in the periods that you're cycling at lower stress conditions than in the previous cycle. So that's good news. And then we just switched on and we went to higher stress levels again. Your seismicity immediately comes, but what you also see is that your high magnitude events come. And so you have some kind of healing behavior of your rock. So it's okay to cycle in a hydrogen storage reservoir at below the previous cycle, but if you then, after a while, go up again to higher stress levels, maybe then your seismicity kicks in to a larger extent as before. Okay, I summarize. I think we need to, first of all, do a good analysis of what kind of effect hydrogen has on the mechanical behavior. And we need to really think about quantifying the effect of cyclic behavior on the mechanical properties of rocks, so that we can really do better prediction of how to minimize failure and seismicity in a reservoir, and maybe what kind of control mechanisms we should apply to minimize that.
Thank you very much, Auke. This is interesting. So is it true that if we survive the first cycle, then we are fine?
If we survive, yeah, in the experiments, yes. In some fields, you have, at least in gas storage fields, you have seen that. So second, third, and fourth cycles don't produce as much as in the first cycle. Yeah.
So we can just be more pragmatic, I guess.
But don't go up too high then afterwards anymore. Yeah.
Questions? You have one, but I want the guests to.
Thanks for the informative presentation. So you may have already alluded to this, but I appreciate if you can elaborate more on what's the impact of hydrogen, because the impact of cycles, in geomechanics is relevant for natural gas as well. So I'm just curious to know what makes hydrogen different from natural gas on the geomechanics. Thanks.
I think I tried to, as a fluid pressure, for me, hydrogen or any other fluid, the pressure creates stress state changes, controlling the mechanical behavior. Whether hydrogen affects the rock properties, the rock structure, that's something we need to study. In literature, you see that we have expected, but I haven't seen experiments where people have done that. Yeah? You see, there are studies how the chemical reactions influenced the structure of the material, but nobody has then done an experimental mechanical study to see so, or at least that I'm aware of.
Work for next year's school. Okay, I have some, Anita, and then you have not asked any question, I guess. So then you get.
Very interesting presentation. Also, my question would be, instead of changing the size of the cycles or the amplitude, if you change the frequency of these cycles, what would you expect the results to be?
We see that slowing down is better for seismicity. Yeah? I also heard Bastian said rate is important. Yeah? So he alluded to don't go too fast for a seismicity purpose. If you are failing, you better fail when you slowly increase your pressure than when you fast increase your pressure.
And Anita, and then we move on to the next speaker.
Similar to your comment, I think I'm missing the comparison with natural gas. That is one. And the other thing is in terms of the frequency that the cycles, because in a natural gas storage, you reduce the pressure over 3-4 months. And how is this mimicking my field? I understand that you do up and down, but is this representing the field?
You mean the experiments?
Yes.
The magnitude of the cycles are the same, roughly.
Yeah?
The frequency is quicker. But
and therefore, I think it's an appeal from my side. We have to be careful with the conclusions we draw, because then only I can compare with the field scale when I compare my Y and my x-axis.
I agree. If the material mainly behaves brittly, frequency should not matter. If it starts to form creep-wise, then frequency is important. Yeah? So then that comparison cannot be made anymore. As long as it's brittle, it's okay. Yeah? From a mechanical point of view, at least.
Let's thank Auke one more time. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.